This, in a way, was the key moment in the project where things started to tie together, which was the biggest question mark from a creative direction point, but just like as a whole, like how is this going to work with so many designers, so many different animators, and like we're just hoping that things work with a very loose color palette.
All right, Jorge, let's get into the actual production here. And I'm really curious to hear about how you approached the concept phase, the design phase. Like, how did you figure out how to crack this nut? And the reason I ask it that way is because there were a lot of asks for this video. We wanted it to promote School of Motion. We also wanted it to kind of make motion design seem fun. I also asked you if some of our alumni could animate on this. And if there was then a way to call out that alumni animated on it. There was really like a whole bunch of things that had to happen. And the script ended up being very long. So how do you even approach like the blank page when you have something like that?
Yeah, so it definitely was, obviously, it's always the most intimidating part, just starting at the beginning and trying to define a concept. And I think like with the asks that you had and the script that we were thinking, like pretty early on, we figured that we wanted some kind of manifesto from both you and ourselves. It was like, okay, we got to make some kind of like statement about what motion, like School of Motion is about. So it really all began obviously there. And sometimes what we did is like, we did a whole bunch of internal scripts that were just working together, like very rough. And then we send it to someone who's actually, you know, professional and helps us to do the script writing. And I mean, we don't have to go through the whole script process, but like a lot of the script and what's working, what's not working, feedback and so on, and different versions. And sometimes even when we were happy with it, we're like, okay, this is way too long. How can we simplify it? And then let's, you know, step back from the script a little bit and imagine this in visuals and see if everything is redundant. Because all of the time, something that might be looking well in the script, it can be said with an image instead of with words, in which case you get redundant things. So where can we cut things? And eventually we came up with what the final script is with the help of a scriptwriter and with your help and different words here and there. And we also found ways to integrate, like one of the asks, which was how do we bring School of Motion alumni to help? And that's one example where we don't need to show it with words, or we don't need to say it with words, but we can show it with images. Like when we say, they created something like this, and even this video that you're watching right now. Like that is a script that only works when you see it with the visuals. So that's kind of like an example of that. And once we had the script, as we were working the script, actually, we're like thinking of visuals. Like that's immediately where our brain goes. And one idea that we were bouncing back and forth internally as a team was, all right, so if this is about getting someone excited about School of Motion and about motion design as a whole, and like maybe they know the process of motion design, maybe they don't. But what if we show that, or we use that as a structure or a skeleton to kind of progress the video in complexity, but also in emotion. So imagine that we have 4 levels. Okay, so this is kind of where we started. It's like the first level is the storyboard level. Like we have rough lines, sketches, basic lines. And then we're starting to add texture, maybe more defined shapes, some abstract shapes, some texture, some color. And third level is like, all right, how about we start introducing some 3D elements and even characters? And at the end is basically a culmination of all the elements together. It's like, how can we bring in those 2D, that 3D element? And in many ways, this frame became a hero. And a bunch of these, like stuff from Gunnar and from a bunch of other people. It's like this guy, like the style that they're using is 3D, but the 2D looks pretty interesting. Like how can we introduce that to our video so that the end is not just a different style, it's a culmination of all the styles that we've been leading up to. So that's kind of the structure that we started with. And then the next thing is, all right, the script is there. We have this rough structure. Now, how can we start designing stuff? And to do that, I need to talk a little bit about our structure as a studio back then, which we didn't have a full-time designer. So now we have Grace, and she's amazing. But back then, it was a bunch of animators without any full-time designer. So all the projects that we had done up to that point were heavily relied on freelance designers. So we were like, okay, who can be good for this project? And it's tricky because when you don't have a full-time or an in-house team, you kind of need to depend, even if you have the perfect person in mind, which we didn't really have, but even if you did, you need to depend on their availability and so on. And then you're like, oh no, this person is not available. Who are we going to find? So it's kind of like a production nightmare sometimes when you don't have that. But the solution for that, at least for us, is to just have a big list of people that we trust so that we always reach to someone that we trust, even if it's someone that we've never worked with before, which happened in this case. So the first person that came to mind was Nuria. And we worked with her in the no code project just before that. And we had kind of pushed her into a direction that she wasn't quite doing as much, was like shapy gradient stuff. And she killed it. So we were like, okay, Nuria will be amazing. But we also knew that the scope that we had, the different styles that we had, and the deadlines that we had, we were like, we're going to need a lot more than one designer. So we had our eyes on Loris Alessandria and Jay Quercia from, way back, even though we had never really worked with them. And so we asked them if they were available, and they said yes. And once we had kind of like this team built, even though they started at different periods, we were like, okay, here's the script. Here's the mood board that we're thinking. Here are some rough ideas, like how to call very, small jams of ideas. We don't want to put too much ideas in their heads. And the first person to start was actually Loris. So these are the very first boards. So Loris started like a day before Nuria. So he kind of started thinking about things before anybody else. And he started thinking about storyboards. Okay, like we had this idea about starting with the eye because we wanted to end with the eye because of School of Motion and seeing motion. So it's like, okay, we start with the eye and then we slowly evolve into more shapes and maybe we bring in some type. And here we enter into the second phase where there's more textures and so on. And then eventually we go into like this timeline of After Effects and we somehow go into a character. And here's kind of like a rough style frame. And we're like, okay, so like after this, we go back and we start talking what worked, what doesn't. And many things were like, I don't know if typography is right. I don't think we should introduce hands or characters so early on. Like, how can we make this a little bit more original? Like a lot of these felt like other pieces and we wanted to kind of like try to find our own language. And then this part with the ball and the skateboard is awesome. How can we tie it together without giving away all the character world that we'll be giving later? And then the first exploration was really cool, but it felt 2D. We wanted to introduce some of like hint of 3D elements back here and so on. So that was kind of like Loris' initial approach. And at the same time, we're working with Nuria, basically giving her the same task. And we're like, right now, like we're not defining who's going to do what. Right now, we're just defining what the video looks like. So there's going to be redundant work. You're going to be doing the same boards until something clicks, basically. And obviously, we're having constant conversations and seeing what works from one, merging into the another one. So these were Nuria's first approaches. And there were some very, very interesting, totally different approaches to the frames as well. And in some ways, we really like how abstract this started. But at times it felt maybe a bit too abstract. So how can we combine those things? And a lot of these ideas were used in different parts of the video. Here is the shapes that Nuria did that ended up at the beginning, and then this ended up at the end, and so on. Obviously, from there was tons of iteration. I kind of just grabbed a couple of the frames that we liked. How can we bring in the idea of audio into the visuals for that section of in the middle? Anyway, these were a bunch of other explorations.
So Jorge, I wanted to ask you about something I'm noticing here. And, I've had the opportunity to talk to Nuria. And so one of the things I know about her is that she's pretty new to motion design. She was sort of more of an illustrator. And I think somehow you found her and booked her. And what is interesting about her work versus Loris's is that this looks very different than everything else I see in the world of motion design. There's kind of like this echo chamber sometimes, like everyone looks at Vimeo and then goes to Gunner's website and looks at that and goes to Bucks. And so you end up just sort of unconsciously drawing the same things and like, the half circle with like a wood texture, that kind of stuff. But Nuria, this is like pretty fresh. Like, you don't normally see this kind of stuff, or at least it's not as common. And so I'm wondering if that's like, are you picking her on purpose because she hasn't been steeped in motion design? She hasn't worked, like at Buck and then at Gentleman Scholar, and, she hasn't done the circuit. So there's maybe like some new ideas in there?
Yes. With Nuria, it's interesting because, I mean, she's definitely deep in the illustration world, but I actually knew her work, even animation work, from a long time ago when I did the Learn Squared course. She actually took it. And she's one of the few that actually finished the project. And she made this cool animation, and it was all shapey stuff. So ever since, I kind of followed her work. And when we were looking for people for the no code, it was like, hey, I wonder if Nuria, like, I know she's been doing a lot of illustration, but I remember back in her days of starting or getting into motion, because she can animate, she was doing this shapey stuff. So like maybe there'll be an interesting, fresh take, like now that she's been in the heavy illustration world, back into like shapey shapes. And sure enough, there was. So in that sense, yes, we were like, okay, if we bring Nuria, she's definitely going to bring that freshness again to this project. But it was more like, honestly, it was more like we've worked with her and we trust her, and what she did last time was awesome, and we want to keep working with her more so than we want someone who's outside the echo chamber in some ways.
That makes total sense. And, I was just curious about, there's like a tension, I think, as a studio owner when you have a project come in and you have the person that you always work with that you're comfortable with. But sometimes you kind of know what you're going to get. And then you could try someone who's a little less experienced or maybe you've never worked with. And you might get something fresh, but you might also get something that doesn't quite work. And so it can be a little bit scary. Obviously, Nuria doesn't fit into that situation because you'd worked with her. But I was just curious if that's ever in your mind, like, I want something I haven't seen before, but that means I may have to take a risk and hire someone I haven't worked with before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't lie that part of the reason why we went with 3 designers for this project was because we couldn't really afford that risk being too high. So we're like, look, like worst case scenario, one of them doesn't really do amazing stuff, but we still have 2 solid people, or even one, like, so in a way it was like, let's try to foresee, let's not expect that, because we're reaching out to these people because we trust them. But worst case, if something were to happen, we still have like a solid take. But yeah, every project that we work with new designers is a big risk. I think now is a lot easier in a way because we have Grace who can has the right vision, and she can direct them. And like, it's not like we're taking a total gamble. Like, we have someone internally that we know can do it, and we're just getting help instead of bringing somebody else completely new to do it all, if that makes sense.
So I want to hear about the color in this piece. And one of the first things that jumped out when I started seeing style frames was sort of how well you took our brand guidelines and our color palette, which has like all of the colors in it. Like, it's really kind of a difficult color palette to work with. We run into it all the time internally because it's every color pretty much, and there's gradients everywhere, and you kind of have to have a real fine touch to get things to read and to get the hierarchy right. So how did you approach color just in general in this piece?
Yeah, so probably the color was it was a tough thing that we didn't solve until halfway through the project. Like, that's just the reality. So yes, we had this brand look that you gave us that was obviously our starting point, which was obviously like the core for everything that we did. But yes, it was crazy broad. So one thing that we did to narrow it down was to focus on this unique gradients. Like, these are, in a way, our basic color palettes. Like, we're going to focus on this gradient. So every time we use some kind of gradient, we're going to try to focus on these colors and this combination of colors, which kind of narrowed it down a bit. But I mean, there were 2 challenges. One was that's still very broad. And 2 is we have a whole bunch of different designers who are interpreting the color palette differently. And because we kind of need to do it all at once, we're all hoping that eventually things will click. So here are a bunch of different style frames from different designers that they're all doing at the same time. Like, Laura's is exploring how the skateboard girl will look in like all these different colors and different skin tones and so on. Like, maybe more real, maybe more yellow. And there's this section with the feedback. Like, what is this going to look like with all those colors? Like, these colors are using the guides, but all of a sudden it's looking really pastel, which really shocks with something like this. And this is feeling a bit too clean, like there's not a connection there. And this feels very much on brand, but at the same time, it doesn't quite have its unique feel. And if we were to go with this style, we would have to apply this style for the rest of the piece. And we kind of want to have some flexibility. And here are like some simple explorations, like what is the eyes going to look like? And here are Jay's frames. And he started introducing this interesting texture. It was like, okay, yeah, let's use the gradients, but we can normalize everything by giving it a bit of a texture feel and something that can be normalized throughout the piece. It's like, okay, there's something there. But the reality is that even with all this and all these conversations and all those different tests, color still didn't match. Like when we had the style frames put together at one point, we realized that things were just all over the place. And I was very thankful that Jay Quercia, so he being from Oddfellows and super experienced art director, he was like, all right, Jorge, what if we just stop focusing on style frames for a bit? Like, I know that time is of the essence, but right now we got to make sure that things will work. And I was like, all right, what do you have in mind? And he was like, we need to do a color script. And to be completely honest, we've never really done one before up to this point. So he started spending probably 4 days trying to tie everything together. It's like, oh, I'm just going to color on top of the style frames that we have to make sure that the colors work and defining a color script. And I was like, okay, let's do it. And part of me was like, no, don't worry, everything's going to work at the end. Let's just keep making style frames because we got to finish this because we have other projects and Blend is happening. I can't remember what it was, but like we couldn't really afford to extend the timeline. So he went and started just painting on top of things. And this is something that we do almost all the time now, especially like Grace is really trying to focus on color, and we're using color scripts like crazy. And it's just painting over the style frames. Say, what is the characters going to look like? Is the circle going to match to the circle, like the color of the circle going to match the skin of the person? And then what are we following here? We're following the red, and the red becomes the logo. And then we're following, instead of color, we're following the shapes, the three triangles. And then we're going to introduce the blue world, where this whole crazy 3D world is going to live. And then we can't really go to the pastel ideas that we had because it's just going to be a super stark contrast. So if the gradients was from blue to red, let's go to like a red, a yellow. And so we start moving there. And then we kind of like, okay, we haven't really had a break. There was like tons of colors all the time. Let's bring in some white back. So, oh, that symmetric shot could be cool if it's all white. And then it's a seamless transition to a more pastel one, which is like the dragon shot. And then we're back to red to finish in ultra colors. So this took quite a few days to get right. And obviously, as you can see, compared to the final product, it still changed a bit. But this, in a way, was the key moment in the project where things started to tie together, which was the biggest question mark from a creative direction point, but just like as a whole, like how is this going to work with so many designers, so many different animators, and like we're just hoping that things work with a very loose color palette. So the color script really was the answer to color. It was like, let's have one person that can just focus on it and make sure it works.
This is so amazing to see, Jorge. So when I hear color scripts, I mean, in my client work days, I never did a color script. And I think the reason was I had this bias that like, oh, that's a thing feature films use because they're concerned about the tone of certain parts of the film. And we want this to feel dark. So we're going to use a dark palette. And it really never occurred to me. So let me ask you this. To me, this looks like obviously there was sort of just a practical use of this color script. We need this to feel consistent. And we need to make sure we're not using too much of the blue and red gradient and mix it up a little bit. Was there any conversation around this section needs to be darker because, of some reason, this section we want it to be brighter and more vibrant because now we're talking about how great life is after you take a school of motion class? Was the messaging driving the color at all, or was it mostly just to get consistency?
No, there definitely was... There was an intention. Like we wanted to start simple. So we're like, okay, outlines on white. Like let's not introduce color. But then we wanted to like echo a couple times of where we're going to go. So like when the eye opens, we wanted to show that we're gonna go to like a really colorful world, but just for a second. And it's similar with the tunnel. It's like we're just gonna hint at you or where we're going. And that was kind of like, it wasn't necessarily much about like which color defines what. It was more about how much color do we use per shots. Like, is this gonna be a heavy color shot, or is this gonna be like a more muted shot? And we tried to balance that. And in some ways it was unconscious. It was like, after we watched the animatic, it was like, whoa, this is like just way too many colors. Let's make this shot like less colors or a white background just to give the eyes a break. It wasn't necessarily like we had like this psychology of color behind, which maybe we should have, but we didn't. It was more like what feels right in the contrast between a lot of color or like having pastels or something more easy on the eyes.
Well, this is really cool. And it also, it's like a great way, I think, of, sort of normalizing the colors between multiple designers. So you mentioned Jay Quercia and Nuria Boch and Loris. So the color script, like obviously super useful to keep consistency. When you have 3 designers and they're all in different geographic locations and stuff like that, Nuria's in Scotland and Jay's probably in, Portland or something like that. So did you have one of them be the lead so that way you weren't playing traffic cop with design? I mean, is that kind of what the setup was?
So initially there wasn't. Initially, basically, I was the lead, even though I wasn't designing. I was just calling the shots, if that makes sense. But I think the moment that Jay kind of like defined this color script, in a way, all things color and overall texture, kind of he became the lead for that. But in terms of like persons that were individually responsible for their shots, like we just divided it, and every person was kind of a lead of their own once that we had those things defined by Jay and myself. And at the end of the day, yeah, it was me in some ways, just saying, okay, this is working, like this is awesome, but what Nuria did is just fits better and it looks cooler. So, we're just gonna use that. So it was a lot of like difficult decisions in that sense. But yeah, like we use this master sheet to keep track. And here you can see like Jay kind of took over the first bit, in some ways the end. Loris took on this whole section at the beginning all the way to the 3D world. Nuria, with some experience with 3D, kind of owned that 3D world. And then back to Loris for this bits. And Jay, basically the rest up to that, except the isometric view and Dragon Shot, which was Nuria and Loris. So there was like it was intentionally divided. It was like, okay, instead of having one lead for everything, Loris is gonna take over like the more 2D flat, maybe some character-y stuff. Nuria is gonna touch pretty much everything 3D. And Jay is going to touch all the other aspects, bookends and middle sections, if that makes sense.
Well, let's hop into Photoshop and take a look at some of the actual work.
Yeah. So, I mean, I should say like, this is, because these are not my Photoshop files, it's kind of like I'm going to take you through someone else's project, which is never ideal. But here is, for example, one of the shots that I animated. And this is Jay's. So the way he built it in a way, I mean, it's pretty, there's no tricks. It's like he kind of just went and started drawing shapes and putting textures on top. And the interesting thing that I find about Jay's files is that just he has a very good sense of lighting, and like the way he used shadows in like a simple circle really makes it come to life. Like this is one layer, this one circle. It's just two colors in one layer to give it that texture. Very simple. And similar to many others, it was like the pink ball is just a pink ball with blue and white, like a couple brushes on top. Like there's no real magic behind it. The thing that is interesting about this shot is that because of the way it's built and the way we wanted it to animate, virtually we were going to have to recreate every single piece of every single layer in After Effects. So in some sense, it was irrelevant how it was built and how clean or dirty it was in Photoshop. Because, like I might be able to use that circle, but I'm going to have to scale that circle. I'm going to have to make it in vector, which means the texture is going to need to scale. So I don't want to use this texture. I'm going to have to recreate it in After Effects. I want the backgrounds to animate, so I can't really use this. So in some ways, like I don't know if I use many of these textures at all, just because we wanted to animate it uniquely. So that's kind of like what's interesting about this specific Photoshop file. But for the most part, it's just layer styles. I mean, not layer styles. Clipping masks on top of just basic shapes. And they're not even vector. They're just literally little circles and so on. So no magic here.
So Jorge, I'm looking at Jay's Photoshop file. I'm noticing that none of the layers, well, I do see one that's rectangle 4, but that was probably automatically named. There's like no naming. It's all just like raster. I'm sure he was painting it on a Cintiq really quickly. I don't know if at the time you knew you were going to be the one animating this, but you're the one paying Jay to make the frame. So like, do you ever just want to say, can you design this so I can use your Photoshop file, or like do it in Illustrator so I can use some of it? Or do you actually not really want to do that to a designer and just kind of say, make it pretty, I'll figure out how to animate it. I don't want you to slow down. I want you to do your thing.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm definitely not going to throw Jay under the bus because he's great. But my personal take is generally, especially now more that I see things as a creative director more so than an animator, is like, you know, right now, I just want things to look great. Like, we've got to define this look right now. And then, like, maybe later, when you give it to an animator, like, take some time and clean up your Photoshop files. So with Jay, we didn't really have time to do that. But generally, I'll tell him, like, you know, if you can work clean from the beginning, do it. Like, we just say, keep in mind, we need to animate this. So, like, keep things named. But some people, for example, Nuria, she will kind of, like, do her own thing. But then she won't send us the final Photoshop files, or the Photoshop files that she sent us. We know that they're not final because she always goes at the end and does a pass that is like animation ready, folder structure, and like cleaning it up. And so that's the ideal. Like that at the end of the day, we do have a clean file, but I am not gonna be annoyed or like, unless it's a total mess, like, I think in many ways, like even if it's a super clean file, the reality is that the animator has to do some kind of recreation and cleanup for their own, because it's just a different process. Like there's always going to be some, but if it's like way too much work for the animator to clean up a Photoshop file, then I would probably mention something. But if it's something like this, I honestly don't make a big deal about it. And I think most designers, like, to a certain extent, they kind of get that sense. And you'll see this other project or Photoshop files. And it would be great if I could open one of Grace's files from other projects, because she started like this. And now she's got the most organized Photoshop files in the history. It's amazing. And it makes our lives way easier. But it's kind of like a process, and you need to know how the animators work. There's got to be some kind of relationship before you just expect the best.
It's always amazing to me when I see like, Jay, I can tell he obviously like, just like his understanding of like light and dark, you know, it's like he could probably paint and stuff. And I'm always amazed at what 2 Photoshop layers can look like. It's like, oh, that's a 3D sphere. No, it's just like a circle and then a highlight and a shadow. That's all it is.
So here's another Photoshop file. This one is created by Nuria. And as you can see, like many designers that I work with, and even I do that myself, like I always have the color palette handy. Like in all my After Effects file, I have a little layer on top just to make sure that we have the right colors and we're managing the right colors. So Nuria is very good at that. And what is really interesting about this shot by Nuria is that there's a lot of extra 3D elements that were not created in Photoshop, that were brought here, were painted, they were brought back into After Effects or Cinema, recreated, put back. There was a lot of back and forth just by the nature of the different styles of this frame. So one thing that we really wanted to do in this frame is like show all the different styles in some way combined. And it's simple things like, okay, well, we'll make the shapes in the background 3D. So like this Wacom render it's a 3D render that is basically painted all the shadows and all the highlights in Photoshop. So say she's like, the good thing about Nuria in many ways is that she has this understanding of cinema and motion. So she can just go in, build a bunch of geometries in Cinema, do a super basic render, like she'll just use this, bring it into Photoshop and start cleaning it. So in here, she had the base and the pen, and then she's just adding all the different layers. And then same with the donuts. So these ones were completely done in Photoshop, knowing that we'll recreate them eventually in 3D. And for the characters, we really wanted every style, say outline 3D, 2D in the characters. So one idea was like, let's make one leg. You might not notice it, but like one leg is going to be 2D.
I actually never did notice that. That's a little Easter egg. I love that.
Yeah, exactly. So one leg is going to be 2D, one arm is going to be 2D, the head's going to be 2D, but the hair and the other leg is going to be 3D. And she wouldn't even have a body. Like it's got to be an outline body, which Dina later figured out how to animate, which is very interesting. And then for the other character, similar idea. One leg is 2D, the other one is cylinder, and then like try to combine these elements into one shot. And obviously here you can see a much more organized file, which is a lot easier to work. And when Dina brought this, Riley into, trying to figure out how she's going to animate it, a lot of it was using the textures that Nuria had built from Photoshop and use them as a matte material, like a base material. And then the reflections and other elements were done in Cinema. But like the basic color was in some ways almost projecting what Nuria had done here into the 3D materials.
Wow. Let me ask you this, Jorge. So looking at that shot as an animator with all of those little nuances, like it would terrify me, right? I mean, this is the kitchen sink that you have to throw at it. I mean, at any point are you like, did anything make you nervous about just how complicated the setup is? Like there's 3D objects, but we're basically throwing away the image information and just repainting them. We'll figure it out later, like reflections. Like, I mean, did you ever get nervous or were you like,
yes,
how do you approach that?
Yeah, it was, this is an interesting shot, not just because it was so complicated and we had no idea how we were going to figure it out, although half the shots were like that. Actually, pretty much every shot was like that. But it was also one of the shots that we decided that we were going to give to an alumni. So it was like double the nervousness because we didn't trust her, just for the simple fact that we'd never worked with her before. So we didn't know their strengths or weaknesses and so on. So yeah, it was terrifying. And one thing that like we do when we're terrified is just break it into pieces, right? Like forget about the intimidating parts, which is how can we make it look like this, and focus on the stuff that It's like if you were just to break this down super bare, you have 2 donuts, a half a circle, a cylinder, a pan, a base, and another circle. Like that's your model, right? Like let's start building the very basic. Let's start seeing how it's going to move. And then as starts, so you're starting to feel more comfortable with the shot, then we can start figuring out textures. And I help Dina did a bunch of 3D tests. How can the rendering look and all that stuff. But it was like, let's start easy. And that's usually the way I start things. It's like, okay, I'm going to start blocking things, the things I understand, and then I'm going to start adding complexity as we go. This is interesting. Like at some point we thought we were going to use this at the very end in a different color palette. So Nuria kind of recolored the whole shot just to see how it would look. We didn't quite end up using it like this, but it was kind of cool to see. And then a Loris file, which is also interesting. So all of us had this noise on top of things, but obviously he is very well experienced also working with motion projects, and we gave him a bit more time to do certain things. So he has a whole layer just for shading, and he has one for the rectangles vector, which if I remember correctly, he kind of did it in Cinema. That was Illustrator. See, I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Sneaky. That's interesting. I wonder why he did that in Illustrator and not just do it in Cinema.
Yeah, I don't know. But
he just did it the hard way.
He did it the hard way. But I mean, in some ways, it's kind of going back to what we talked to before. Even if he did it in Cinema, we would likely still have to recreate it because of the movements that we want and the camera and the extrusions that we want. Maybe we would have had a starting point. So in some ways, it doesn't matter too much. I think his Photoshop file is clear enough that we know kind of where to start and where to add things. One thing I wanted to talk about here is the character, which went through a lot of variations. So Loris had the first style frame was the skateboard. And then at some point, both Jay and Nuria did their own take on the skateboarder. and then like different skin tones and different all sorts of things. And eventually this is a combination of Jay's idea, and then Laura's kind of cleaned it up and put it in here. And it was cool to see how each one approached the different shadings and colors. But ultimately, this is built in Photoshop with the intent that we'll recreate it and do it in 3D.
That's amazing. So that skateboarder is just Photoshop layers.
Yep.
So there's like actual artists, and then, and then there's the rest of us. It's amazing.
So when we got those boards, I went to the cinema, and like, I'm not an expert by any means, but I was like, okay, with the little I know, how are we going to recreate those little shadings? And this is a very fast render of how this could look. And it still would need like some comping and some love, but like at least we have a base of what these things can look. And it's really just a cylinder with a bunch of reflection and a Fresnel in the texture, and then a couple nice lights. Like it's very, very basic. But in some ways we're like, okay, it's doable. Like we can recreate it to a certain extent, and then we can like do some comping magic when needed to make it look exactly like the style frame.
So sometimes you will go to the effort of doing, I mean, it's not a motion test or anything, but it's like, is it just to help you sleep at night? Like, okay, now I know that this can be done, and it's not going to have to be brute force, hand tracked, reflections in After Effects, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also like a lot of the times whoever's working on that shot will ask me for help. And the way my brain works is like, well, let me try it a bit, see if we can troubleshoot this together. And then we'll end up coming with solutions from both sides. But like, yeah, this is kind of like very basic, just gradients. How can we fake the lighting of, like, say this is a yellow light, this is a pink light, but we're just putting gradients on top. Like, we're not actually putting new lights. This is just one blue light and one yellow light. That's it. But a lot of it is just brute texture. Right.
It looks like just really kind of blurry reflections.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of it you're faking, some of it are real reflections. And yeah, it's really interesting technique. Are there any other like Photoshop things you wanted to show? I mean, we've covered a lot in this video. So, I mean, I feel like.
So, yeah, this is Nuria's brain a little bit. And I feel like a fraud going through her brain. But yeah, she has a very specific sketch style. And if you ever see her streams or her Procreate process, like, you can see like the sense, like the line quality and the flow. It's just she just got it down. And so here you have your sketch in the back, and then you have the color scripts that we did with Jay with a little happy face. So this is the weird dragon. I don't even remember where this dragon idea came from, but it was a fun idea. And then she also again used those references that we talked before for 3D elements, so that she doesn't have to think them from scratch. And then here we wanted to show like a 3D world, like we're inside cinema, but it's kind of crazy. So we had kind of like elements like the camera and polygon. And this guy's my favorite. I just love that face. And like 3D cubes and so on, kind of like we're inside a crazy world in Cinema 4D. So it was cool to see how she approached it while building it in 2D, creating a 3D world.
And this shot, Jorge, this ended up being cell animated, right? Was it like just traditionally animated, or was it a mix?
It was a mix. The character and the dragon were all cell, and then everything else was a combination of 3D and After Effects. But yeah, that dragon was, it was crazy. It took us forever.
Yeah, well, I know we'll get into that in a little bit, but I would have nightmares looking at this frame if I was animating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not, I mean, we had some ideas of like making the dragon body 3D and actually rigging it. And we tried I believe we tried some waves in cinema. And again, Victor might talk more to that, but we never ended up using it. We realized that cell is a way to go. It's a short enough frame. Let's just do it hard.